This tiny mirrorless camera has all of the hallmarks of being an amazing street or travel camera. It's small, lightweight, and has some pretty powerful internal specs, and best of all, you can find them in abundance on auction sites like eBay, priced anywhere between $200 and $300. And most of the options that I came across at that price were paired with an array of lenses and accessories too. In fact, I actually picked up my camera for around £200 on eBay, which is around $250, and it came included with this 18.5mm f1.8 prime lens and this retro leather camera bag, which definitely doesn't look like my mother's purse before you say anything. But the reason why this camera is just so cheap is probably the same reason why many people have never even heard of them before, and that's because this range of cameras was actually scrapped after it failed in a pretty spectacular kind of way. So if that's the case, why do I think this J5 is still worth talking about in 2024? Well, this is the Nikon 1J5, and it was part of Nikon's first ever attempt at breaking into the mirrorless camera market. Now, collectively, they were either known as the Nikon 1 range or sometimes referred to as Nikon CX format cameras, but essentially they all started out in 2011 with two core flavors. At the bottom of the totem, there was this J range, and as the name of this particular camera implies, this was the fifth in its lineage. Above the J range was the V line, which was designed to be a high-end class of camera with slightly better specs and in most cases a built-in EVF. So sadly, Nikon only ever went on to make 3 models of the V cameras before scrapping the range prematurely back in 2016. In 2013, Nikon introduced the S range, which was designed as an entry-level option positioned beneath these J cameras. But these were also very short-lived, with Nikon pulling the plug after just 2 iterations. There was also a one-off all-weather model called the AW1, but that range never made it past the first model. So the J range was the only line of cameras to survive right from the start all the way to the bitter end, when in 2018, Nikon finally decided to shelve these CX format cameras altogether as they changed tactics and started developing their new line of full-frame and APS-C sized mirrorless cameras. So with a total of 11 cameras from the Nikon 1 range to choose from, why did I go for this J5 specifically? Well, this camera was not only the last of the J lineage, but it was also one of the last Nikon 1 cameras to ever be developed, which means that in terms of specs, it was also benefiting from the best tech the range had to offer. Also, stylistically, when you compare this J5 to just about any of the other CX format cameras, it really does stand out like a sore thumb, but in a good way. The designers did away with the point and shoot compact style aesthetics in favor of a more serious, professional looking design with this two-tone metallic and faux leather finish. Though, just to be clear, this is actually not metal, it's very much plastic. But anyway, as a result, the camera doesn't even look like it belongs in this whole family of cameras. Now, perhaps this was just a case of Nikon taking a very sharp left turn as one last-ditch attempt to save this whole camera range from the impending cliff edge up ahead. Who knows? But whatever the reason, doing away with the familiar soap bar-like design not only made this camera look better, in my opinion at least, but it also made it a lot nicer to handle. Specifically, they gave it a proper hand grip and a rear thumb rest, which was something seriously lacking on all of the other options. Although there's no EVF on this camera, there is at least a generously sized 3-inch touchscreen on the back that can pull out and flip over 270 degrees, which is obviously ideal for shooting at high and low angles. It also has a pop-up flash, a dedicated mode dial, and 2 separate command dials. I mean, sure, the second dial doubles as a D-pad and is a little bit on the fiddly side to use, but the point is that all of the core features you would hope for in a camera are present in this. For me though, it's the J5's miniature size and featherweight that makes this such an appealing option. Even with this slightly larger prime lens on the front, it's still more than happy living in my jacket pocket, meaning that it's a completely plausible option for an everyday carry-along. But ultimately, no camera is entirely perfect, and there are certainly a few things about this design that won't make it perfect for everyone. Personally, the biggest gripe I have with this design is this button right here. Now, for some unknown reason, someone high up in the Nikon design department decided it was imperative that this camera should include a dedicated button for Wi-Fi transfer so that at any point you can connect this camera to your phone for transferring images. Now, obviously that is great and super handy if you're someone who uses that feature a lot, but for the rest of us, there's just one small problem. If you happen to press this button by mistake, it completely locks up the camera for a little over 8 seconds whilst it tries to connect to the Wi-Fi. And once this process has begun, there is no backing out of it until it finally prompts you that you can now navigate away by pressing the menu button. Now, in the grand scheme of things, 8 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but when you're out shooting, a few seconds can be the difference between getting the shot or completely missing it. And unfortunately, there's no option in the settings menu on this camera that allows you to reassign this button to something more useful, so you are just stuck with it as is. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not something that I press all of the time, but on the few occasions that I have pressed it, I have found that turning the camera off and then on again is actually a little bit quicker than just painfully waiting it out. But still, I really do wish this wasn't a thing I had to endure. But obviously, this one small gripe isn't going to be enough to cause the entire downfall of a camera system. So what did go so wrong for Nikon? Well, it's almost impossible to say for certain, but my hunch is that ultimately I think that these cameras were up against just way too much strong competition from the likes of Sony, Fujifilm, Panasonic and Olympus, all of which at the time were offering cameras that featured larger micro four thirds or APS-C size sensors. Whereas just like myself, this camera only has a 1-incher. But as I told my wife the first time I met her, don't be put off by the size. It may look like a needle, but it works like a sewing machine. And the same mindset should be adopted for this J5 sensor, because sometimes being smaller than average does come with a few unexpected advantages. Firstly, it means it can offer faster readout speeds, and by teaming this with an electronic shutter, this camera can actually rattle off shots as fast as 60 frames per second. Now, as impressive as all of that sounds, and it certainly is impressive, especially considering its age, speed is only as good as long as you have the stamina to match, and unfortunately that's where this camera falls down ever so slightly. With such a small frame, there really wasn't enough space to include a full-sized SD card slot, so instead we have to settle for a micro SD, and that means at 60 frames per second, no matter if you're shooting RAW or JPEG, it doesn't take all that long before those 20.8 megapixel files cause everything to screech to a halt. But let's be honest, spunking out 60 images in a second is overkill for just about every situation I can think of, so I found that reducing this speed to 20 frames per second or slower is more than enough. Now, I should mention at this point that this camera was also marketed as being able to capture 4K video footage, which I thought was pretty damn impressive for a camera of this size and age. But it seems you do need to be a bit of an expert at playing hide and seek in order to actually find that option, because it's not available whilst using any of the default shooting modes. Instead, you actually need to navigate over to the dedicated video mode using the mode dial, and then head up to the advanced movie modes and select it from there for some reason. But don't get too excited, because as I found out, 4K capture is capped at 15 frames per second on this camera, basically meaning that the results are unusable by today's standards. And although it does include a micro HDMI port for attaching a monitor, there's no hot shoe, no headphone, and no mic jack ports either. So this camera really isn't geared up for any kind of serious video work anyway. But that said, Nikon did get a number of things right with this camera. The biggest win being the autofocus, as even by today's standard, this camera is rapid. As I mentioned earlier, this camera entirely relies on an electronic shutter. There's no mechanical shutter at all, which I know will split some opinions. But one key advantage to this is that it can operate completely silently. In fact, the first time that I shot with this camera, it did take me a little while to get used to this idea, because there's no visual or audio cue to signify when a photo has been taken. You've just got to kind of trust that once you fully depress the shutter button, the camera is going to do its thing, which, to be fair, it seemed to do without failure. You can of course turn on the artificial shutter sounds if you don't mind your ears bleeding, but I actually love the fact that this thing is such a silent shooter, particularly for situations where you need to shoot incognito. Now, despite the small sensor, the image quality is actually very respectable, with the raw files producing nice natural colors and plenty of dynamic range for pulling back details from the highlights and shadows. Although 20.8 megapixel images may seem a little low res in today's world where we're more accustomed to 30 or 40 megapixel chips, the images this thing churns out are still plenty large enough for cropping in post and producing decent sized prints if that's your thing. Though, let's be honest, most of us will only ever post our images online, and in which case this camera is more than up to the job. Also, as a slight side note, all of the images you're seeing here have been edited using my Lightroom preset pack, which is available for purchase on my website if you're interested. Oh, and make sure you use the discount code on screen now to receive an additional 10% off. Now, I can't obviously talk about image quality without also mentioning the lens that I've been using on this camera, and as I mentioned mentioned at the start of the video, I actually bought this J5 bundled alongside this 18.5mm f1.8 prime lens. Now at first glance, an 18.5mm lens may sound like a super wide focal length, but when you consider that this 1-inch sensor has a crop factor of around 2.7 times, after doing the maths, you'll realize that the images you end up creating will look something closer to that produced by a 50mm lens on a full frame camera. Now another thing to consider is that with lenses this small and front elements this small, even at f1.8 you really can't expect to capture images with a super thick and pleasing bokeh, unless of course you are able to shoot up close and personal with your subject. But for street and travel photography, this may not be a deal breaker. I think the saddest thing about this Nikon J5 is that it's probably going to be consigned to the history books as being a failure, but if you are prepared to look past its flaws and play to its strengths, then there's actually a lot to love about this imperfectly perfect pocket camera.